Hello everyone and welcome to Live on Air tonight. Sitting next to me is Jim Pearson. You know Jim pretty well, I think, from some of the other talks we've had on issues of war and peace in the 20th century. And tonight we've also got Stuart Mannins in, and the three of us are going to discuss the final in Jim's series, which is the War on Terror. Later on it will lead to another live on air event about a theology of resistance that we've discussed at various stages in Jim's series. But starting tonight with, I'm just going to share a screen and bring up what questions we're looking at, and because of a few technical difficulties, oops, I just stopped sharing that screen. I think it's the wrong screen that I shared. There we go. No, it's, yep, I've still got the same technical difficulties, so I'll stop sharing the screen. Essentially, we're going to look at 5 questions tonight. We're going to start with Jim just exploring a little bit about himself, giving us a bit of background about who he is and his family and so on. Thanks. Over to you, Jim.
Well, thanks, David. Great to be here as always. Yeah, I live here on the shore, not too far from where we are. I'm married to a wonderful woman. She's her name is Heidi, and she's a Persian Kiwi. So we both met in New Zealand. We've got a couple of kids. So yeah, and I think her background might be interesting, especially in light of what we're talking about tonight.
Yeah, right. I think that's a really good intro, because it does mean that we've got someone who's living with relatives that are caught up in all of these events, has got a history. So, okay, we're going to kick off tonight with a question about not ISIS, but rather about some of the tactics that ISIS employs, and in particular the sort of the lone wolf tactic. What exactly does that mean?
Oh, a lone wolf is someone who acts alone, and they'll often cloak their actions, their agendas, with sort of catchphrases or symbols that might come from a wider, more global movement. But yeah, they usually do act alone, and these larger groups, these larger entities, may or may not take any credit for it. But it would involve maybe taking over a restaurant or a cafe or a company, and with threats and demands. So yeah, I think one example I mentioned in the presentation was the guy over in Sydney last December. His name is Man Haron Moniz. So, and down under in this part of the world, that really brought a lot of terror and a lot of fear. People were glued to their tellies for a day or two there.
Yeah. And another example, I think, of that kind of tactic would be the Boston Marathon.
Yes.
Where who knows who primed who up to do it, but it's clearly an act of terror that had enormous consequences.
Yes.
Interesting in the Australian case, you've reminded us in your presentation, Jim, that the guy was actually wanted for fraud in Iran.
Yes.
And the Australian authorities didn't either pick it up or act on it.
Yeah, well, no, it just nothing came of it. Is how CNN reported it, and it's a tragedy. But on top of that, in a more local reality, there in Australia, he was actually on bail for some very serious, violent offenses. So he was at large, and the bizarre thing was that he was a bit off the radar. But Prime Minister Tony Abbott knew very little about him, and
what makes it really interesting and topical is the fact that he's wanted for violent crimes in Australia, but at the same time, he claims a kind of ISIS-led inspiration, but I would very much doubt whether ISIS had any kind of control of this guy.
No, I know. I don't think they ever took any credit or had any comment. There was a flag with some Arabic on it, which you could see from the footage that was in the cafe window, and but so here's a case where he used the ISIS symbolism to cloak actions, but he was sympathetic to victimized Muslims around the world. He was Iranian, and so he was a Shiite branch of Muslim, and then converted over to Sunni Muslim, which is what most of the Arab-speaking countries are in the Middle East. And he was a bit of a cleric, but if you read a bit more between the lines, a lot of people did not take him seriously, and police have said that he had some serious mental health issues as well.
Yeah. So, I see that we've been joined. We've got 5 viewers along with Stuart,
great.
Jim, myself. Many of you, I suspect, will know Jim from the series on War and Peace in the 20th century, and this completes that particular series. So just as a little thing, if you want to participate in the chat, if you're viewing this live broadcast, if you take your mouse and sort of hover around the top where I'm pointing, you should see a little square that's got 9 dots on it. And if you toggle that, it should bring up your question and answer pod. So you could type in questions. We don't necessarily see those questions for quite some time to come. Now, we've got a kind of a technical limitation here tonight because Jim and I are working in somewhat constrained circumstances, and Stuart's pointed out that we're not in a good light. We haven't got a lot of light streaming onto us, so you have to bear with us on that. Okay, so moving on, thank you for joining us.
You mentioned the John Key comment, is that, I don't know.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a good way of rounding off how does the lone wolf situation fit our living in New Zealand?
Yeah, well, I in this section about the lone wolf, I concluded with a quote by our Prime Minister here in New Zealand, John Key, and the situation was going back to February of this year, and he said, okay, New Zealand's going to deploy 140 odd military personnel to help fight ISIS, but he downplayed secondary domestic risk in New Zealand, like there being a fallout of people like the lone wolf, the man from Iran, the cleric with a criminal record in Sydney. And basically, John Key, he said, quote, because I don't think there are many potential extremists in New Zealand, end of quote, which I think he's opening himself up there, and I think that's a bit naive.
Yeah, I think some of the events this year have proved that actually there may be more background activity going on here than was given credit for. Okay, we've got a couple of comments too that we want to make about ISIS itself. First of all, what is ISIS, Jim?
What is ISIS? Oh boy, that's a big that's a big question. It stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham. They basically their leader has proclaimed himself the Caliph. He's the spiritual leader, al-Baghdadi. Al-Baghdadi, like the city, al-Baghdadi, and he basically June or so of last year. He walked into the Grand Mosque in Mosul, Iraq, and he gave a sermon during their time of fasting, Ramadan, and he proclaimed the caliphate, the physical and spiritual territory of Muslims, and so which really is something new. There hasn't been a caliphate since the 1920s, when it was the end of the Ottoman Empire.
So the last caliphate was Turkey.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
Ottoman, the Ottoman Empire. So it's sort of 1924. So it's sort of roughly the last 90 years, Muslims around the world have not had this kind of reality.
Right.
Hmm.
So that's a bit of background to what ISIS is. It really is an organisation that wants to claim land
Yeah.
for its own political
They've got
purposes.
some very well-established beliefs. Despite President Obama saying that they're Al-Qaeda's JV team and saying that they're not Islamic, they actually are, and they see themselves also as key agents in the coming apocalypse.
Yeah, they've got strong religious beliefs,
Yes,
haven't
right.
they? So I can see Stuart sitting over there. Stuart, you would be an infidel in ISIS terms.
Thank you. Slay me.
No, but I guess and for the reality for many is that they do in fact end up getting slayed for their beliefs, slain rather for their beliefs. They, you know, that's the cruelty of what ISIS represents. It's an immense cruelty. You've mentioned a scholar here, a Princeton scholar, Bernard Heikal.
Yes.
And would you like to just tell us a little bit about what Heikal said about ISIS?
Well, he's considered to be sort of the expert on ISIS theology, and Bernard Heikal. He has some, I think, the father's Lebanese, but he definitely has a Middle Eastern background, and so. And he claims that the slavery, the crucifixions, the beheadings, all these things that are typical of ISIS and their influence in the region, that they are merely acting out what their religion has historically required, and that they are reliving the early period. And what he means by that is the 7th and 8th century, the spread of Islam through Muhammad and his armies, through the Middle East into North Africa, and then over into the Persian Empire, and then even up into Europe and Spain and France, where they were finally stopped about 732.
Yeah, I mean the whole history of that part of Europe, southern France, Spain, etc. You've got this huge Islamic influence. And I think in this respect that many Christians, North American Christians, English Christians, less so European Christians because they've lived through it, but Christians in Australia and New Zealand are basically unaware of the huge confluence of religious strife that's gone on, or strife in the name of religion as well as in the name of who will own the territory, who will own the land.
Yes.
Yeah. There's also, you've mentioned another scholar, Graham Wood, and his question, or my question really is, do you think today, or does Graham Wood think today, that we can actually conquer ISIS by military means?
Well, he's extremely well articulated. He's a journalist and did just this huge in-depth article about ISIS in the background, and now he gives a few, I guess, solutions. The one obvious one for Graham Wood is that the Western powers should overpower ISIS militarily and occupy what is now their caliphate in Syria and Iraq, and so to physically dominate and take over the territory, and then that would diffuse their influence. It's bad PR basically for ISIS when that happens. But he said this could possibly happen just through the bombings and how the Allies are currently slowly bleeding them. But he also kind of ends with a comment that they could actually be their own undoing. The fact that they have no allies, no legitimate allies, and then that vast sort of areas of their territory are quite barren and unpopulated. So Yeah.
That's a question that we will come back to. Who could support ISIS within the Islamic world? I think that's a really interesting and difficult question. But ISIS has had, along with, from the time of 9/11, first Al-Qaeda, then ISIS, this has had an enormous effect on American society.
Yes.
Now, you're an American, you're married to an Iranian lady, so I think one of the big political things that happened in America was a thing called the Patriot Act. What was that? What was that all about?
Yes, David. Well, that came into being not long after 9/11, and then the State of the Union speech in January of 2002 with George W. Bush. And the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act came into being basically to give U.S. spy agencies and the FBI powers, basically through electronic surveillance, to pursue Al-Qaeda and other armed groups overseas. But what I was afraid of was sort of basically the America becoming more fascist and just really a scary big brother. And we went back to the States for a couple of years. That was sort of 07, 08. And there was a lot of what was called profiling, police profiling of Arab Americans and Middle Eastern Americans, families that had been in America for generations, but they were suddenly on the radar for possibly harboring cell groups of Al-Qaeda. It actually was a very disturbing time.
Did you have personal difficulties when you were actually entering the country because of being married to an Iranian?
Yeah, well, yeah. There was a bit of I wasn't roughed up or anything, but there was a bit of a there was some tension with some guys in immigration in Los Angeles, and so my wife had sort of a temporary green card, and we were coming into the country, and there was, I could just sense there was a lot of sort of negative sort of feeling, and
not an easy time.
No.
And you were there for 2 years.
And I was jet lagged, and like he wanted like the day we got married or something, and I just kind of paused and I gave him the date, and he said, yeah, right, I believe that, and I thought, where's the attitude coming from? But yeah, I mean that could have been part of this culture of fear, the paranoia that I sensed at the time,
which fueled the Patriot Act.
Yeah. And I think the fears. I mean, at the time, I think it was from both parties. It wasn't liberal fear or conservative fear. I think it was across the board. Be that really the intelligence community had not done its job, and that two planes crashing into the Twin Towers in New York in the middle of the morning, it wasn't good enough. I mean, so there were legitimate reasons for bringing it into being, but I think the powers were just too universal, too controlling. It was just this dragnet. And it was actually to the point where they could hack into people's cell phones and get information.
Yeah, there was a very disingenuous statement in the New Zealand Listener when it was talking about the 3 top spy positions in this country in the last edition that came out last week. And the article was a great article, there's no question of that. The 3 women were controlling the different aspects of New Zealand intelligence community. But one of them, I think it was Miss Kitteridge, the Director General, who said, "Oh no, we there's only 200 or so of us. We couldn't possibly look at personal emails and things like that. And I thought it was so disingenuous to write this, to say this, because of course, what on earth do we belong to the Five Eyes, the Five Nations for, except to have massive computer programs, the algorithms that are churning. And I'm not saying I'm against it. What I'm saying is it's disingenuous to say that it doesn't go on. And that was kind of the breakthrough for you and the US, because the Patriot Act gave way to something else, didn't it?
Yeah, well, what happened a couple of years ago, and still very much in our subconscious, is Edward Snowden, and who I believe was based in the Far East, I believe Hong Kong, but he was working for the NSA and started leaking information, and sort of all our fears were confirmed, basically, that they really were secretly and systematically collecting massive amounts of phone data on American citizens, that it was not just suspects or suspected leaders of Al-Qaeda cells in America, but it was normal everyday citizens.
Yeah. I think Snowden, whether you view him as a traitor or whether you view him as the ultimate patriot, he did do one service to the whole of the free world. He brought back into the open the idea that we need an open society.
Yes.
You may be able legitimately to gather data on what people are doing, but you do have to be open about it. I think that was, and so the US did pass a Freedom Act that replaced the Patriot Act.
Yeah, and that's happened just very recently, David. That's been like the last couple of months. In May of this year, the U.S. House of Representatives passed it, and then it went on to the Senate. And then President Obama, in fact, he just signed it in the beginning of June, I believe, of this year. And that's been renamed the USA Freedom Act, and it keeps sort of these general capabilities, but it ends that dragnet of just picking up everything that normal citizens are chattering about. So it's become more focused.
So I guess what I've been intrigued by with Jim's comments so far is that essentially he represents, him and his wife represent the two major sort of players in a very real sense. Their cultures are the cultures that are dominating the international news scene, for a decade now. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that irony was brought up at our wedding. Actually, a poet friend of mine mentioned the irony that here's an Iranian lady and an American man getting married, and so he poked a bit of fun at the media and how the rhetoric is just dripping between the two countries. But yet here are two citizens from those countries, they've fallen in love and then they're getting married, and here we are celebrating it. So, yeah.
And you're celebrating it in New Zealand, which is at the end of the earth.
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
So
here we are.
Let's just turn now to the winds of jihad, because you've noted Bruce Shelley, the noted church historian, he wrote Church History in Plain Language, which I used to give Kindle editions and paperback editions.
It's a wonderful work. Yeah,
it's one of the great works of church history. But Shelley has said that the passions of the crusading age seem to be spreading anew in the 20th century. Yeah. So what have you got to say about that?
That's ironic, because the Crusaders, as Stuart pointed out a bit earlier before the broadcast, that the Crusaders were Christians from Europe, and so but he's applying the language to Muslims, and so he basically sort of he highlights developments at the end of the last century. For example, the Shah, who was in power, who was very pro-West, pro-American, and then the fall of the Shah and the start of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in the late 70s, and Ayatollah Khomeini, and I remember him, and his follower. I remember him, angrily punching his fist at the TV, and people burning the American flag. And here I was in my young teens at the time, and then. But not just in the Middle East. It was places like Pakistan, churches and Christians were being attacked openly throughout the 1980s. There was the National Islamic Front in Sudan in the early 80s, where there was the armies from the Arab North were attacking ethnic African Christians in the South. And it eventually led to civil war, and there are two countries now, actually, but a very long, horrible struggle. Attacks, I can remember the attacks on the U.S. Marines in Lebanon, and then a couple of embassies in East Africa that was getting into the 90s, the mid-90s or so, and then the Chechen terrorists against Orthodox Christian Russia. Palestine versus Israel, and I mean those are just some of the highlights that Shelley brings up. But yeah, there really are some jihadist winds that are starting to sweep through the world.
Yeah, it fans out in many directions. Now I'm not even sure who is the majority religious force in the world, whether it's Christianity or Islam. I mean, at some point, Islam will, if it's Christians, at some point, Islam very soon will overtake it in terms of sheer numbers. And as you've got all of these sort of tendrils of fire moving through these countries, the question has to arise for other nations like Australia, New Zealand. It's particularly relevant in Great Britain, where you've got big Muslim communities. How are we going to relate on a religious level? Because I think there's something that most Christians, when they're thinking about Islam, don't really seem to grasp, and that is that the number of people involved in terror organizations is infinitesimal.
Yeah,
it's not as if Islam is rocking up against Christianity. Would you agree with that, John?
Right.
I mean, if there are 1 billion Muslims in the world, and each of them were on one of these kinds of jihadi missions, we'd be living in a totally different state. And that worries me, that so much of the Christian rhetoric is directed as anti-Islam, rather than anti Al-Qaeda,
jihad, and it's more of a terrorist sort of exactly. Well, I'm ever the peacemaker, and I'm all for dialogue and talking through things, and I've met a lot of Muslims in my life, and a lot of them are peacemakers as well. So
It's an issue that I think the churches have to face up to. I know that.
So I'd be all for this, interfaith dialogue and sitting down and talking, and in fact, the current Pope Francis wanted to do that with ISIS, but I think that the problem there is they would quickly try to manipulate circumstances and probably try to take him and his people hostage as well. And I mean, it would quickly become a very hostile situation. That's the problem with it.
Stuart, I'd like to just bring you in at this point. A couple of weekends ago, we were at a seminar over at St. Luke's Presbyterian Church, the community church over there that's got a kind of liberal outlook, and they had a visiting professor from Ottawa. And he belonged to a Christian community that had done a very unusual thing. Could you remind us of what that was, Stuart, please?
Oh, what a question, David. What were they doing? It took me a fair amount of time to follow what he was saying. They were doing something very, very different.
Yeah, they were. They were very different in terms of being Christian, but they had in fact hired someone from the world of Islam.
Oh, yes,
Was it
yes.
to lead them in their prayer life, or I can't remember?
No, I think just to inform them. To say, in our honesty, there are a lot of things we don't know about other people that we ought to know if we're going to get on with them. Now, one thing we can do is pay for a accredited Muslim to come and tell us what he thinks they really believe in Canada, so that we can know our neighbours better. That's what I thought he was doing.
Yeah, it was a really interesting initiative for primarily a Christian group to take. You know, that their paid leader effectively was a Muslim, and it was so different from what we would normally expect that I was quite taken with that.
No, impressive. I like that.
Yeah. Just coming back to you, Jim. You've got a quote here from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. Now, Jonathan Sacks, I'll let Jim do the quote, but he was the chief rabbi of the Commonwealth in Great Britain, and a more articulate and informed Jewish leader you could not come across. I mean, probably the books that I read consistently most often about faith come from the Jewish community rather than the Christian community.
It's interesting, yeah. Oh, well, David, there was a plea for diversity and what he calls particularity against Universalist cultures, and this was back just after 9/11, and this was in an article in a British newspaper, and basically Universalist cultures is what he was fearing, but what he goes on to explain himself that they are the cultures that they tend to believe that they have the universal truth. They set out to convert the world, and if that doesn't work, they impose it by force. The classic Universalist cultures are ancient Greece, ancient Rome, medieval Christianity, Islam, and the Enlightenment. And in fact, I found out about Rabbi Sacks through reading a book by Richard Bauckham, a British theologian. And so Bauckham, he goes on to say, well, look, Sacks is suggesting that global capitalism is the sixth Universalist culture, and that it's with us now. And he even goes as far to say that 9/11 was not a clash between East and West. It was not a clash between Christianity and Islam, but it was a clash between global capitalism. He calls it McWorld versus jihad, which is the elements in Islam that are forcibly trying to spread their religion. So and he says it's a clash of meta narratives. So these Universalist cultures have this story. It's a big story, but it's a story, and they keep telling it over and over. Like, for example, Rome and the state gods of Rome, and how they'll take over people, but yet they do it in a way that's very civil, and they let people retain their cultures as long as they pay taxes. So that was very briefly the Roman meta-narrative. But the global capitalism is Microsoft, it's McDonald's, it's the world becoming smaller through business and but basically it's the economically powerful people that are gaining from this spread of this global force of economics.
It's interesting that the ones that Jonathan Sacks has mentioned, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. You talked about Rome, which could be a very cruel institution in terms of conducting warfare. But by Greece, I'm fairly sure he means the empire created by Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander was, if you think the Romans were cruel, Alexander was a lot worse than the Romans in some ways. It's interesting too, as I was doing, Jim and I met on Friday for a coffee to discuss this talk, and I went home and did a bit more research, and I found, believe it or not, John Wesley, he was looking at a very similar problem. He was talking about Machiavelli representing the worst kind of Italian influence, but he said, if you think Machiavelli is bad, you should read this Englishman. And I can't remember who the guy was, as some sort of obscure person, but the same problems emerging time and time again, where you manipulate whatever the market is for your own enormous personal gain. And I think these cultures of Greece, Rome, medieval Christianity, Islam, and the Enlightenment, and probably now global forces, that's really in the ballpark as far as I'm concerned, of we are being manipulated all the time in ways that we don't really acknowledge or understand. And you've got that brilliant idea of the clash of meta-narratives. Now, well, I've just alluded to the fact that none of this is new, and I specifically want to bring Stuart in here. You've got a little bit of prepared stuff on why it's not new, Stuart, if we go back to the time of the Crusades. What have you got to tell us about that?
Well, I've got questions. You see, my question, David and Jim, is why is it that religions who share so much in terms of ethics from the axial period 2,500 years ago can justify or motivate cruel acts against their enemies, the infidel, under the umbrella of a religion? How can this happen? It happened under Islam, it happened under the Crusades in the 11th century, it's happened with the Jewish nation at times, it's happened with everybody. Maybe that's just a way of disguising what at basis is tribal conflict. And if we want to have conflict and we want to dominate other people, we'll find a way to excuse it, rather than finding an explanation in the religious thought of the particular religion.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Stuart. There's a question, why does this happen? Could I just earth it into New Zealand context? If you look at the land wars in the early part of colonisation of New Zealand, you've got not dissimilar sets of things at work. And for us as the dominant Pakeha culture, we might sort of just feel, well, it was a colonial force at work. But there are instances, for example, in after one battle, the colonial forces rounded up a group of women and children and forced them, I think it was into a schoolhouse or it might have been a church, and burnt it down and all the people in it. So there you've got people who would be more than nominal Christians doing what are certainly not Christian acts of compassion, kindness, loving one's neighbour and one's enemy. And so your question, I think, is actually a question that's broader than this problem of the war on terror and all of these things. It is, what's human nature all about?
I'd agree entirely with that. And I would like to look at all these examples and see what are the common threads of them. What does it make Christians act like this? What does it make Muslims act like this? Is it a feeling that they're the only ones are right? Is it that they have God's permission to dominate over other people with the right way? I don't know.
What are your thoughts on it, Jim?
Yeah, I just a lot of cruelty has been done in God's name. It's it's horrible, and it just seems to well, the famous statement, the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history.
Yeah.
And I mean as Stuart was talking, I've been thinking back to the beginning of the Crusades, where Pope Urban II, he told the first Crusaders, yeah, go down there, and I'll promise you forgiveness of sins. You take part in this first crusade. They wanted to defeat the Muslims that threatened Constantinople, save the Byzantine Empire, reunite East and West the churches, reconquer the Holy Land, and then hopefully win heaven in the end. But he was playing on it. Also at the time, it was a time of hardship. There was drought, there was bad crops, there was disease in Europe, and so these guys were ready to put on their armor and a cross and go off and fight Muslims.
I think Jim's made a really good point there about what happened in Crusades and the kind of context from which Crusades were happening. Stuart, I think it's also the fact that the Crusades weren't just directed against the infidel Muslim, were they? They are directed as much against the Christians in Constantinople.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Constantinople was. This was getting on to the early 13th century. They were sacked and they brutally taken because there were some misunderstandings. There was some deception on part of the Eastern Pope, although he wasn't called a pope. But and so for about 60 years there, East and West were reunited, but at what price? I mean, that hasn't been forgotten at all. That was during the Fourth Crusade. They didn't even make it to the Holy Land because of what happened with Constantinople.
And that's probably a good point on which to end. That these forces in history do repeat themselves because we don't learn from the past. We haven't had any questions that have come through in the Q&A pod, but what I'd like to recommend as we draw to a close is that you go back, if you've come in through night school, which I suspect most of our viewers will have, you may well have already read Jim's PowerPoint notes. I put them in as a PDF. It's in the night school pages. And also, I'd like to refer you to Stuart Mannon's review of The Quest for a Global Ethic by Kenan Malik. And Stuart, it's over in the second page, isn't it? Chapters 6 to 10, I think.
The second page being a collection of chapters.
Yeah, chapters 6 to 10. Stuart's got excellent summaries of those chapters. And a final plug, if you are going to go and have a look at the material, if you respond to 5 forum posts, you will get your open badge for work in the book club forums. And we're just on the cusp of issuing a whole lot more open badges within Six Senses. The site is a very exciting and dynamic site. But in the last few months, I've been working extremely hard to get the creator team making more and more resources so that people that are coming in for the first time actually realize there's a whole raft of resources that have been put together by a lot of different people. And that includes, for example, Stuart's magnificent review of Kenan Malik's book, for which we gave him a reader-writer open badge. And if you get a badge, you'll see it says you can claim this badge in your passport. Just go to it, click it open and put it in your passport. And if you're on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or Google Plus, you can just click it and it will send it over into your Facebook page. And people in Facebook think, what the heck is that? I've never seen anything like that. They click on it, and it takes them back into the evidence pages in 6 Senses, a marvelous social media network tool. Well, I'm aware that we've gone past time. We usually say 40 minutes. We're now 45 minutes into this broadcast. Jim Pearson, thank you very much for doing
David.
this. I've really enjoyed working with Jim on this whole series. I think we've created a really viewable set of resources that you can find in the forums. This, of course, is the first time that we've done a recording live of the kind of question and answer sessions, and don't try and go into it tonight because I may want to do a bit of editing, but it will be there as a link you can click and view tomorrow. Great. So the whole thing is recorded. It's a fantastic tool that, well, we've had to learn how to develop it, and I've enjoyed doing it. So once again, thank you to Jim, and thank you to Stuart.
David. Yeah.
Okay.
Been great.
We'll say good night.
Bye.